Chapter 8. The Stories We Tell to Protect Ourselves. Human beings like to think of self-deception as something rare. A dishonest politician, a manipulative partner, a corrupt executive, a propagandist knowingly spreading falsehoods. But most self-deception is quieter than that. Far more ordinary, far more human. Most people are not consciously lying to themselves all day long. In fact, the most powerful forms of self-deception often operate precisely because the individual experiences themselves as sincere. The mind protects coherence automatically. This protection begins early and continues throughout life. Human beings construct narratives that allow them to preserve identity, emotional stability, moral self-image, belonging, continuity, and psychological survivability. Without these stabilizing narratives, the psyche can begin fragmenting under contradiction, shame, uncertainty, or existential anxiety. Self-deception, therefore, often emerges not from evil but from protection. The mind bends perception in ways that preserve emotional equilibrium. This is one reason people frequently reinterpret events after the fact to preserve a coherent sense of self. Failures become someone else's fault. Successes become evidence of personal virtue. Harmful behavior becomes justified by circumstance. Motivations become cleaned up retroactively. Memory itself becomes selective, emotionally reorganized around preserving internal consistency. Human beings are remarkably skilled storytellers when the self is involved, and the stories usually feel true. A person may genuinely believe they are acting from principle when resentment is quietly driving the behavior. Another may believe they are pursuing love while actually pursuing validation, safety, or status. Someone may convince themselves they are just being realistic, while fear quietly governs their worldview. Another may frame avoidance as independence, aggression as honesty, cynicism as intelligence, conformity as morality, or emotional dependency as loyalty. The mind rarely says, "I am protecting myself psychologically right now." Instead, it constructs explanations that preserve dignity while obscuring the deeper emotional dynamics operating beneath awareness. This process is not entirely conscious. In many cases, people discover the narrative only after they have already begun living inside it. That is part of what makes self-deception so difficult to detect from within. The deceiver and the deceived occupy the same mind. And because human beings experience thought internally, it is easy to mistake familiarity for truth. Repeated explanations begin feeling self-evident simply because they have been rehearsed emotionally and narratively for years. The mind prefers coherence to contradiction. Contradiction is psychologically expensive. To hold conflicting truths simultaneously requires emotional maturity, uncertainty tolerance, and a willingness to endure discomfort without immediately resolving it into simpler narratives. Many people unconsciously avoid this tension by collapsing complexity into emotionally manageable stories. This happens individually. It also happens collectively. Entire groups construct narratives protecting identity and moral self-image. Nations reinterpret history. Institutions protect legitimacy. Families preserve emotionally necessary myths. Political tribes rationalize inconsistency. Religious communities defend sacred assumptions. Social movements simplify their own motivations while exaggerating the corruption of opponents. Human beings are often far better at detecting self-deception in enemies than in themselves, which itself becomes another form of self-deception. Because one of the deepest protections of the ego is the belief, I am less vulnerable to these distortions than other people. The examined life begins partly when this illusion weakens, not into self-hatred, but into humility. A person starts recognizing that the mind is not a neutral instrument transparently perceiving reality. It is a meaning-making, self-protective, emotionally conditioned system, constantly balancing truth, belonging, identity, fear, desire, and coherence. This realization changes the way a person interprets certainty. Certainty often feels intellectual, but sometimes certainty is emotional stabilization masquerading as intellectual confidence. This is especially visible when beliefs become fused with identity. Once a person's self-concept becomes emotionally dependent upon a particular narrative, contradictory evidence can begin feeling psychologically threatening. The mind then mobilizes defensively. Rationalization, selective attention, reinterpretation, motivated reasoning, emotional dismissal, moral reframing, memory distortion, and tribal reinforcement. The person may sincerely believe they are protecting truth while unconsciously protecting identity. Again, this is not necessarily malicious. It is profoundly human. The psyche often values survivability over objectivity. And in many situations, this tendency is adaptive. A completely unfiltered awareness of every contradiction, uncertainty, limitation, vulnerability, or existential ambiguity could overwhelm psychological functioning. Human beings require some degree of narrative continuity to remain emotionally stable and capable of action. The goal, therefore, is not the impossible fantasy of perfect objectivity. The goal is increasing awareness of our own tendency toward self-protective distortion. The examined mind asks difficult questions. What story about myself am I protecting? What emotional need does this belief satisfy? What discomfort am I avoiding? What would become psychologically threatened if this narrative weakened? Am I pursuing truth here, or emotional reassurance? What evidence would genuinely change my mind? Do I want reality, or do I want relief? These are not comfortable questions, which is precisely why they matter. Because without them, human beings can spend decades unconsciously defending narratives assembled primarily for emotional preservation rather than honest examination. This becomes especially dangerous when self-deception combines with tribe, ideology, status, or power. Entire systems of distortion can emerge where emotional reinforcement continuously rewards blindness. Groups begin mirroring one another's rationalizations until the narrative itself becomes socially stabilized. At that point, questioning the story may feel almost impossible, not because alternative perspectives are unavailable, but because too much psychological structure depends upon the existing narrative remaining intact. And yet, awareness still changes something. A person who begins recognizing the mind's self-protective tendencies becomes slightly less trapped inside them. They begin noticing when certainty feels emotionally necessary, when identity is shaping interpretation, when rationalization arrives too quickly, when resentment is distorting perception, when ego is disguising itself as principle, when narrative coherence is overriding curiosity. This awareness does not eliminate self-deception permanently. Human beings likely never fully outgrow it. But awareness introduces friction into the process. And friction matters, because the distance between impulse and examination is often where greater honesty becomes possible. Perhaps that is one reason genuine self-awareness tends to produce humility rather than superiority. The more honestly people examine themselves, the harder it becomes to maintain the comforting illusion that the unexamined mind belongs only to others.